The sun blazed overhead, showing no mercy in its descent, and the dry air above the sagebrush seemed to shimmer, as if the land itself was murmuring in the heat. The hum of a cicada filled the silence between the pines, and a hawk soared alone in the sky, searching for its next meal. Along that endless road, where dust kicked up with the slightest touch of a boot, a woman struggled, leaning on broken crutches that buckled under her weight. She was 28, but pain had etched years onto her face, and her breath came in ragged gasps, a testament to her endurance. Her name was Lyra, though most in the town whispered it with disdain, if they spoke it at all. By her side, a girl with wild, honey-colored hair, just 6 years old, tried to steady her mother's sleeve. A younger boy, barely more than a toddler, tugged at the hem of her skirt, his cheeks flushed red from the sun and exertion. They pushed forward until a cabin came into view at the tree line, silent and wooden, standing guard over a man's solitude. By the time Lyra reached the porch, her crutches failed her, and she collapsed against the rough boards, her body convulsing with pain. Dust clung to her bruised arms, and the children cried out, their voices too faint to call for help across the wilderness. Yet the door creaked open, slow and cautious, and a man emerged. His frame filled the doorway, broad-shouldered and worn by the dust. His sleeves were rolled up, and his eyes narrowed as if to keep the world at bay. He was 32, known as Peregrine, a rancher who had shunned company for many seasons. Solitude had molded him into someone stern and reserved, but the sight before him challenged the walls he had built around himself. Lyra lifted her chin, though her lip quivered. "Sir," she said, her voice a mix of pleading and bravery, "if we clean your cabin, would you let Mama rest here?" "She's too injured to walk any further." She tightened her grip around her mother's shoulder as if her small strength could keep the woman upright. Beside her, Valiant stared at Peregrine with wide eyes, clutching the stranger's boot, as if it were the only steady thing in a world that spun too fast. For a long moment, Peregrine stood without a word. The wind rustled through the grass, and the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The whispers of the townsfolk echoed in his mind, warnings and judgments that women like Lyra brought only trouble, that widows or abandoned souls spelled doom for men who offered them refuge. Yet before him lay a mother who could barely breathe, and 2 children with a courage born of desperation. "Get inside," he growled finally, his voice low and rough from disuse. He lifted Lyra from the ground. She flinched at first, then went still, surprised by the closeness of his chest, for no one had carried her in many years. Inside the cabin it was dim, thick with dust, the windows clouded from neglect. He gently placed her on a makeshift bed near the wall, and the children sprang into action, their movements fueled by a mix of urgency and excitement. They swept away cobwebs with their sleeves, organized a pile of boots into a neat corner, and gathered tin cups scattered about. Their laughter, though soft, broke the long-standing silence that had lingered in the room. Peregrine leaned against the table, arms crossed, his gaze tracking their hurried movements, with a blend of discomfort and reluctant admiration. Lyra attempted to sit up, wincing slightly from the pain in her ribs. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the weight of her gratitude was too much to bear. She tried to smooth out her dress to make herself smaller, less noticeable, but the bruises on her arms told a different story, one of battles fought and endured. Peregrine noticed her attempt to hide them and looked away, not out of disregard, but because the sight stirred something within him that he couldn't yet identify. The hours ticked by as small hands scrubbed and cleaned, and Peregrine found himself at the stove preparing a meal from the remaining supplies. beans, a small piece of meat, and a pot of stew that filled the room with a comforting warmth. He watched the children eat, their heads bowed in relief, and listened to Lyra, her voice strained but patient, as she gently urged them to slow down and chew. When she reached for her crutches, Peregrine acted before he could think, taking the worn sticks from her grasp. "These won't support you for another mile," he said, setting them on the table and examining their cracks. "I'll fix them." She started to protest, but the look in his eyes silenced her. It wasn't quite kindness, nor was it pity. It was something more steadfast, a silent acknowledgement of her resilience. He worked quietly, hammering in new nails and smoothing rough edges, while she watched from the cot. And when he returned the crutches, stronger though still simple, she accepted them with a nod, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. Neither spoke, yet in that fleeting touch, something delicate began to grow. As dusk fell, Lyra moved to the porch. The sky blazed with streaks of orange and red, the horizon stretching out wide and unforgiving. She stood, braced on her repaired crutches, her children huddled beside her, and whispered to herself, "I'll leave at dawn if I must. I can't bring more disgrace to another man's name." Peregrine, standing in the doorway, shadows dancing across his face, heard her words. He didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. Shame. That word bound them both. For years he had carried the burden of whispers and cruel laughter from neighbors who had once mocked his failed attempt to court a widow. He had retreated to this cabin, choosing solitude over ridicule, hard work over companionship. And now here she was, echoing the same pain he carried. Night fell, and the lantern light cast soft glows across the wooden walls. Lyra sat, mending one of Peregrine's torn shirts, her hands moving slowly, but with practiced ease. The youngsters had drifted off to sleep on a nearby blanket, their breathing as rhythmic as a gentle melody. Peregrine sat opposite her, his elbows resting on his knees, silent. He observed the needle weaving through the cloth, the lantern light highlighting her scars, and felt the silence expanding with an unspoken weight. Within that quiet, a confession began to form. Not a lifeless voice, but the world would not leave them unscathed. The next day, around noon, riders traveled along the path, locals whose stares cut deeper than any arrow. Their murmurs drifted across the field, filled with condemnation, that she had found another unsuspecting victim, that he had welcomed disaster into his home. Lyra's face drained of color, her body curling inward. She turned away from the window, shame burning through her like a wildfire. "I shouldn't have remained," she murmured, tears welling up though she held them back. "You'll be tainted, just like me." Peregrine stood, the tension within him snapping. He stepped out onto the porch as the riders slowed, their eyes filled with contempt. The moment stretched out, the silence of the landscape pressing in. He took a deep breath and let his voice ring out, steady and defiant. "She is here because I want her here," he declared. "And if any man has an issue, he can take it up with me." The riders exchanged glances, grumbled, and rode away. Inside, Lyra shivered, torn between shock and relief. Peregrine returned, kneeling before her, his calloused hands reaching out despite her urge to pull away. "Lyra," he said, his voice low but resolute, "I've been alone for too long. I don't care what they think. Stay. Not as a burden, but as the woman I choose." Her breath hitched. She searched his face, expecting mockery, pity, anything but the genuine sincerity she found there. Lyra and Valiant huddled close, their eyes wide, sensing the gravity of the moment. Lyra shook her head, whispering, "You don't understand what I've endured. I'm no prize, Peregrine. I'm only trouble. He took her hand, scarred and trembling, and pressed it to his chest. You are more strength than trouble, and I'd be a fool to let you leave. The children clung to her skirt, their small voices pleading. Mama, say yes. Tears streamed down Lyra's cheeks, her defenses finally crumbling. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, and whispered through her sobs, yes. In that instant, the world changed. The porch was no longer a place of banishment, but a new beginning. The children laughed and ran into the yard, their joy unbounded. Lyra melted into Peregrine's embrace, his arms wrapping around her with a promise deeper than words. The horizon stretched wide, the sun turning golden, and the land seemed less unforgiving, as if it too sighed in relief. I'm curious, from what corner of the globe are you tuning in? If this story touched you, give it a like and tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Subscribe to Frontier Stories and join us as we continue to tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beautiful, messy truth of Wild West.